Under the soft glow of hanging lights, the small town community hall buzzed with laughter and chatter. It was one of those rare evenings when everyone in the neighborhood gathered to celebrate together. The event was called a talent night, something that gave ordinary people a chance to show what they could do. Children were running between the rows of chairs, old men were polishing their glasses, and young women were giggling in corners. There was excitement in the air, but also a playful kind of energy, the kind where people teased each other, made little jokes, and dared friends to go on stage. The hall itself was nothing special. The wooden floor creaked when too many people moved at once. The stage was small, with an old piano sitting to the side, untouched for years. A few microphones stood ready, wires trailing across the floor. Despite the modest setting, to the people of the town this hall was their theater, their concert hall, their place of pride. Tonight everyone wanted to see who would surprise them, who would make them laugh, and who would win their applause. Among the audience, sitting quietly near the back, was a woman hardly anyone noticed. She was dressed in a simple dress, neat but not flashy. Her hair was pulled back plainly, and she kept her eyes down as though she didn't want attention. She was known in town, of course, but only in passing. People recognized her as someone who lived quietly, someone who never tried to stand out. She never raised her voice, never pushed herself into conversations, never showed off. To most, she was just another face in the crowd. As the evening began, the first performers walked on stage. A teenage boy tried stand-up comedy, his voice nervous, but his friends cheered loudly anyway. Next, two sisters sang a pop song off-key, but the audience clapped kindly. Then an old man recited poetry about the fields and the changing seasons. Each act drew smiles, laughter, and sometimes teasing, but the atmosphere was forgiving. This was all for fun. No one expected professional talent. In the back row, the modest woman watched quietly. Her hands rested in her lap, and though her eyes sometimes drifted toward the piano on stage, she quickly looked away. It wasn't her night, she told herself. It wasn't her place. She was here to enjoy the show like everyone else, not to become part of it. But in groups of young men sitting nearby, whispers began. They noticed her stillness, her quietness, and they began to tease among themselves. Maybe she should go up next, one said with a grin. The others laughed. They weren't being cruel, not really, but there was a sharpness in their amusement. They didn't expect anything serious. They thought it would be funny if someone like her tried to perform. The evening rolled on. Applause followed each act, and the host, a cheerful middle-aged man with a booming voice, kept encouraging the crowd. "Who's next? Who else dares to show us their secret talent?" he called. People shouted names, pointed at friends, and laughed. That was when one of the young men raised his hand and called out the modest woman's name. The hall stirred. People turned to look. She froze in her chair, her heart jumping into her throat. The host, sensing the crowd's interest, smiled and played along. "Ah, yes, why don't you give us something?" he said warmly, gesturing toward her. At once the crowd began clapping, half teasing, half encouraging. Her cheeks burned. She shook her head, waving her hands as if to say no, but the clapping grew louder, and laughter mixed into the noise. It was the kind of moment where saying no only made people press harder. She lowered her eyes, feeling every stare on her. For a second, she thought about standing and walking straight out the door, disappearing into the night. But something in her heart held her in place, a strange mix of fear and pride. She didn't want to be mocked, didn't want to be treated as a joke, yet she also didn't want to let them win by running away. As the voices rose, the host chuckled and added, "Come now, it's all in good fun." The crowd cheered again, stomping their feet lightly on the wooden floor. Children pointed, old ladies smiled, young men leaned back in their chairs waiting for a show, and all eyes pressed down on her. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of her seat. At last, almost against her will, she pushed herself up to her feet. The room gave a light cheer as if a challenge had been accepted. She moved slowly, carefully, as though each step toward the stage might break her. Her modest dress brushed against her legs. Her shoes clicked softly on the floorboards. People whispered as she passed. Some faces were amused, some expectant, and a few curious. What could this quiet woman possibly do on stage? The piano sat waiting in the corner of the stage, dust clinging to its edges. It looked as though it hadn't been tuned in years. The modest woman approached it, her breath shaky, her heart pounding louder than the applause. She could feel the smirks, the stares, the unspoken jokes hanging in the air. And yet, as her hand brushed against the polished wood of the instrument, something deep inside her stirred. She took the seat, lowered her gaze, and let the hall fall into a hush of expectation. The night had started as a cheerful game, but in that moment, something unexplainable hung over the hall. Nobody knew what was about to happen. Not the laughing young men, not the host who had teased, and not even the modest woman herself. All anyone knew was that she was about to touch the piano and everything would change. The room was buzzing with whispers and laughter as the woman sat at the piano. Some people thought it was all a harmless joke, while others leaned forward, curious to see what she would do. The young men who had first called out her name were grinning at each other, nudging and laughing quietly. They had no idea what they had set into motion. To them, this was entertainment, a way to turn the shy woman into the evening's comic act. The host, standing at the side of the stage, smiled in a friendly way, but deep down he also expected nothing serious. He had seen this happen before, someone nervous, someone pushed on stage, and usually it ended with a few clumsy notes or awkward stammering. The crowd would laugh, clap politely, and move on to the next performer. He thought this would be no different. The woman, however, felt the weight of every eye on her. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them above the keys. She could hear a few muffled chuckles from the back of the hall. Every laugh pierced her heart, making her question why she had agreed to walk up here at all. She could have stayed in her seat. She could have ignored the teasing, but now here she was, facing the piano like a soldier standing at the edge of a battlefield. One of the young men whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Careful, she might break a key with the first try." The remark earned a ripple of laughter from his friends. A woman near the front shook her head with disapproval, but she said nothing. The teasing had spread through the crowd. People weren't being cruel in a deep way, but their smirks and whispers created an atmosphere of doubt. The modest woman closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the sound. Her breath was shaky. Her heart felt like it was racing faster than she could control. She remembered the reason she had always stayed quiet, why she never drew attention. People judged her quickly, often unfairly. They saw her simple dress, her humble life, and they assumed she had nothing to offer. Tonight was no different. The audience wasn't expecting talent, they were expecting a mistake, a stumble, a reason to laugh. The host gave her an encouraging nod, trying to make her feel at ease. "Take your time," he said gently. His voice was kind, but it carried that same tone people use with children when they know nothing serious will come. That tone cut deep. It was another reminder that nobody in the room believed she could surprise them. From the side rows, people leaned. And to get a better look, some parents hushed their children, wanting to see what might happen. Others whispered to each other, "Do you think she can even play?" The replies were always the same. "Probably not. This will be quick. It's just for fun." Every word floated up to the stage, reaching her ears like poison. Her fingers hovered just above the black and white keys. She knew this moment mattered. She could either let the crowd laugh at her, proving them right, or she could show them something they never expected. For years, she had kept her music to herself, hidden in the privacy of her home. Her piano had been her secret world, her escape from a life of quiet struggles. But no one knew that. Not her, neighbors, not her family, not even her closest friends. The young men in the back row were now whispering bets to each other. One said she wouldn't last more than 5 seconds before standing up in embarrassment. Another said she might at least hit a single note, then stop. Their laughter echoed faintly across the wooden hall, fueling the tension. For the woman, this was no longer just a playful dare. It was a test. A moment that could either break her or change her. She felt small sitting there, fragile under the stage lights. But somewhere deep inside her heart a flame flickered. She had always been modest, always avoided the spotlight, but tonight the spotlight had found her, and she could no longer run away. The hall grew quieter as people settled into their seats. Waiting for the performance, the laughter died down, replaced by an expectant hush. Even those who doubted her leaned forward now, eager to witness what they assumed would be a stumble. Yet, beneath the surface, curiosity began to creep in. What if she actually played? What if she had something to show? The host gestured toward her again, smiling politely. "Go on, whenever you're ready," he said. The crowd chuckled softly at his words, a nervous kind of laughter that filled the silence. The woman opened her eyes, lifted her chin slightly, and took a deep breath. Her fingers lowered slowly toward the keys, and though she still trembled, her heart began to steady. She was no longer hearing the whispers, no longer seeing the mocking smiles. All she could feel was the piano beneath her hands, an instrument that had once been her closest friend. The audience leaned in, waiting, some ready to laugh, some ready to clap politely, but none prepared for what was truly about to come. And then, in that fragile, expectant silence, her hand touched the piano. The joke was about to end, and the truth was about to begin. Her hands hovered above the keys, and the hall was completely silent. The woman could hear her own heartbeat thundering. In her chest, it was so loud she thought the audience might hear it too. She closed her eyes for a brief second, remembering the voices in the crowd that had laughed and teased. She wanted to leave the stage. Every part of her wanted to stand up and walk back to her seat. But her legs felt heavy, and her pride whispered inside her heart. If she left now, she would always be remembered as the woman who was too weak to even try. She took a slow breath, her fingers still floating over the piano. The weight of expectation pressed down on her. The young men who had pushed her to do this leaned forward in their seats, smirks on their faces. They were ready for her to embarrass herself. The host gave her another small nod, pretending to be encouraging, but already thinking about how he would cover up the awkward moment. A few children whispered to their parents asking what she was going to play, but the parents shrugged. No one knew. The woman's modest nature screamed against the pressure. She had never liked attention, never liked being the center of a crowd. All her life she had been quiet. She spoke little, worked hard, and stayed humble. People knew her only as a face they saw in the marketplace or walking home with groceries. No one thought of her as someone special, and maybe that had been her comfort. But now that same quietness had made her the perfect target for this joke. She lifted her head slightly and saw the piano in front of her. It wasn't just wood and keys to her. It was memory. It was the long nights years ago when she had practiced until her fingers ached. It was the hours she had spent alone, pouring her emotions into music when no one else cared to listen. It was her secret, her safe place. To the crowd, it was only a dusty old piano, but to her it was a voice she had silenced for too long. The audience waited, some impatient, some curious. The air in the hall felt heavy with anticipation. A single cough broke the silence, followed by a stifled laugh. The woman tightened her fingers. She felt as if she stood at the edge of a cliff, one step away from either falling or flying. She thought of walking away again, but something deep in her heart whispered that this was her chance, maybe the only chance she would ever get. Her lips trembled as she whispered to herself, so softly no one else could hear. Just one note, just one. Her hand lowered, and she pressed a single key gently. The sound rang out, clear and strong, and it silenced the hall instantly. For a brief second, even the young men who had mocked her froze. The note wasn't broken. It wasn't clumsy. It carried something pure, something that made people stop breathing for that heartbeat of time. She kept her hands resting on the keys, unsure if she could go on. But inside her something stirred. The sound of that one note reminded her of who she was, of the talent she had buried under years of modest living and quiet struggles. She felt the weight of the stairs, but now they didn't feel like chains. They felt like witnesses. She realized that maybe tonight wasn't a punishment, maybe it was a calling, a moment she had avoided for too long. Still, Doubt clung to her mind. What if she failed after the first note? What if they laughed louder than before? The fear was real, but it no longer controlled her. The piano was there, waiting. Her hands began to relax. Her breathing slowed. She told herself again, just one more. Behind her, the host raised his eyebrows. The single note had been enough to surprise him. He expected a broken sound, a flat mistake, but instead, it had filled the hall like a drop of water falling into stillness. The audience, too, leaned in closer. Their laughter had vanished, replaced with curiosity. They were no longer laughing at her. They were waiting to see. If she had more, the woman's fingers spread across the keys. She could feel the smooth surface under her skin, and it felt natural. It felt like home. The years she had spent hiding her skill began to rise up inside her. All the hours of practice, all the songs she had once played in secret, all the emotion she had poured into music. It was still there. It had never left. She pressed another key, then another. A soft chord filled the air, and the hall went even quieter. People were holding their breath now, waiting for what would come. The modest woman was no longer just a joke, no longer just a target of laughter. She was becoming something else, something the audience hadn't expected, but at that moment she didn't think about them anymore. She didn't think about the mocking voices, the smirks, or the whispers. She thought only of the music, the sound that carried her heart. She was still trembling, but it was no longer fear, it was energy, the kind that comes before something great. The modest woman who had been pushed onto the stage as a joke now sat ready to show them the truth. Her first note had silenced the hall, but it was only the beginning. Deep inside, she knew she was about to change everything. Not only for the crowd, but for herself. And with her hands resting fully on the keys, she prepared to play. Not to prove them wrong, but to finally let the world hear the voice she had kept hidden for so long. Her fingers touched the piano with a calm that even surprised her. A moment ago her heart had been racing, her hands had been shaking. But now, as soon as the keys pressed down, a strange quietness filled her chest. It was as if the music itself had reached out to hold her steady. The first real notes flowed, not broken, not unsure, but smooth and strong. The sound carried through the hall, and the laughter that had once echoed there was gone. Every head in the room turned toward the stage, every whisper died in an instant. The audience had expected clumsy noise. They had prepared themselves to laugh kindly, to clap politely when she gave up. But what they heard was different. It was the sound of someone who knew the piano well. Not a beginner pressing random notes, but a musician who understood every key. The melody started soft, like a secret being revealed, then slowly grew deeper, filling the hall with something none of them had expected. Children stopped fidgeting in their chairs. Young men who had been smirking leaned forward, their smiles fading into stunned silence. The host, standing to the side, forgot to speak. His hand that had been ready to take the microphone back now fell slowly to his side. The room was no longer a playful crowd waiting for a joke. It had become an audience. Captured by music, the modest woman sat straighter as the song unfolded. Her hands moved faster, her confidence growing with each note. The piano responded as if it had been waiting for her. The old wooden hall with its creaky floorboards and dusty curtains suddenly felt like a grand theater. The sound bounced off the walls, wrapping around the people, pulling them into her world. For her, the world outside began to disappear. She no longer saw the crowd, she no longer heard their whispers. She was somewhere else, somewhere where she and the piano were the only two things that mattered. The music carried memories of her childhood, of the first time her fingers touched keys, of the lessons she had once taken long ago. It carried the weight of the years. She had stayed silent, hiding her gift, pretending to be ordinary, and now it carried the freedom of release. The audience sat frozen. Some clasped their hands together, others leaned back in awe. They weren't just listening, they were feeling. Each note seemed to sink into them, reaching emotions they didn't expect. An old man wiped his eyes, surprised by the tears. A young woman held her breath as the melody climbed higher and higher. Everyone had forgotten this was supposed to be a joke. The young men in the back who had started the teasing were no longer laughing. Their faces turned pale as they realized what they had done. The one who had shouted her name now looked down, ashamed. His friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had wanted to humiliate her, but instead they had revealed something extraordinary. The modest woman's expression changed as she played. At first it had been shy, nervous, her eyes lowered, but now her face was calm, focused, and filled with quiet strength. It wasn't pride or arrogance, it was something purer. It was the look of someone finally doing what they were meant to do. The glow of the stage light reflected in her eyes, and for the first time in her life she did not feel small. The song, built toward its heart, the keys striking faster, deeper. The notes were no longer whispers. They were declarations, bold and full of life. The audience leaned forward as though the music itself was pulling them closer. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. The hall was trapped in the spell she had woven. Somewhere near the back, a child whispered, "It's beautiful," and even that small voice carried in the silence. The parents next to him nodded but said nothing. They too were caught in the moment. The woman's music had stolen the hall from its playful atmosphere and transformed it into something sacred. She played as if the years of silence had finally broken open. All the emotions she had buried inside her heart flowed through her hands into the piano. Sadness, joy, longing, and hope. Every piece of her soul was in those notes, and the audience felt it. They weren't just listening to music, they were hearing her story, her struggles, her quiet strength. When her hands slowed, the melody softening, the audience leaned forward even more, not wanting it to end. Each fading note hung in the air like magic. They clung to it, afraid that when it stopped they would lose something precious. Finally, her fingers rested, the last note echoing softly into silence. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. The modest woman lowered her hands, her heart still racing but her face calm. She had done it. She had given them the truth of who she was, and for a moment the entire hall seemed to bow to it. Then, as if released from a spell, the audience erupted. Claps, cheers, shouts, all crashing together like a wave. The quiet woman, the one they had laughed at, had stunned them silent with her first note, and now she had left them begging for more. The clapping thundered through the hall, but the modest woman hardly seemed to notice. She was still sitting on the piano bench, her fingers gently resting on the keys as if they did not want to let go. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her heart still racing from what she had just done. For a long time she had carried her music quietly, hidden away, but now it had spilled out of her like a flood, filling the room, filling every ear and changing the way people looked at her. When the first wave of applause began, she lifted her head slowly. The audience was on their feet, cheering, with wide eyes and open mouths. Many of them still looked shocked, as if they could not believe what they had just heard. The young men who had teased her sat frozen, their faces red, their hands clapping awkwardly because they didn't know what else to do. The host, who had been so ready to end her act politely, stood to the side with his mouth slightly open. He clapped too, but his eyes were full of awe. The woman's modest appearance had not changed. Her plain dress, her quiet face, her simple shoes were still the same. But to the audience she was no longer the same person. With every note she had played, she had transformed. They no longer saw her as someone ordinary. They saw her as someone extraordinary. Her music had carried something deep, something more than just skill. It carried emotion. It carried years of silence and struggle. It carried the beauty of someone who had learned life's pain but still held on to hope. The audience could feel it in their hearts. That was why some of them had tears in their eyes without even knowing why. That was why they couldn't look away. A mother in the front row held her child close, whispering, "Listen, this is what talent sounds like." An old man shook his head slowly, whispering to the person next to him, "All these years, and we never knew she could do this." People began to exchange looks, half ashamed that they had never asked more about the quiet woman, half proud that she belonged to their little town. The woman herself felt something shift inside. For years she had told herself that her music was nothing, that the world would not care. She had hidden it away. She had convinced herself she was too ordinary to be noticed. But as the crowd roared and clapped, she realized that wasn't true. Her music mattered, not just to her but to others. It had touched them, and she could see it written across their faces, the young men in the back, the ones who had started. The joke looked down at the floor. Their laughter had vanished completely. They shuffled in their seats, embarrassed. One of them whispered, "We shouldn't have," but his voice was drowned out by the cheering. They had wanted to make her small, but instead she had grown larger than any of them. The host finally stepped forward, raising his hands to calm the crowd. His voice shook a little when he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we just discovered something very special tonight," he said. His words sent another wave of clapping across the hall. The modest woman gave a small bow of her head, her cheeks flushing red. She wanted to shrink, again to slip back into the shadows, but the crowd would not let her. People began shouting, "Play another, play another." Their voices rose together until it felt like the roof of the hall would lift. The woman shook her head at first, her hands tightening on her lap. She wasn't sure she could do it again. She wasn't sure her heart could take it. But the crowd begged, their voices filled with excitement, their eyes filled with hope. She looked down at the piano once more, her old friend, the instrument that had been her secret for so long. She thought about all the years she had walked past it at home, too afraid to let anyone hear her play. She thought about the loneliness of playing only for herself, and now here was a crowd that wanted to listen, not to laugh, not to tease, but to truly listen. Her fingers trembled as she placed them back on the keys. She glanced once at the crowd and saw faces glowing with respect and wonder. Some were smiling, some were wiping tears, some were leaning forward as if they couldn't wait. For the first time, she didn't see judgment in their eyes, only admiration that gave her strength. She began to play again, this time with more confidence. Her hands moved gracefully, her back straight. The music flowed smoother, richer, as though the piano itself was celebrating with her. This time, the crowd didn't wait until the end to react. They sighed softly, they nodded their heads, they let the music take them away. The hall was no longer just a hall, it had become a place of beauty, of connection. The modest woman played not for applause, not to prove anyone wrong, but because at last she was free, free to share what she had always carried inside, free to stop hiding. Each note was her truth, each chord was her story. She poured herself into the song until her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. When she finished again, the applause was even louder. People were shouting her name now. People who had ignored her for years were looking at her with shining eyes. The same crowd that once mocked her now treated her like a star. And through it all, she sat there quietly, her hands folded on her lap, her head lowered, still the modest woman she had always been. But in the hearts of everyone who had heard her, she was no longer just modest. She was unforgettable. The clapping thundered through the hall, but the modest woman hardly seemed to notice. She was still sitting on the piano bench, her fingers gently resting on the keys as if they did not want to let go. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her heart still racing from what she had just done. For a long time she had carried her music quietly, hidden away, but now it had spilled out of her like a flood, filling the room, filling every ear and changing the way people looked at her. When the first wave of applause began, she lifted her head slowly. The audience was on their feet, cheering, with wide eyes and open mouths. Many of them still looked shocked, as if they could not believe what they had just heard. The young men who had teased her sat frozen, their faces red, their hands clapping awkwardly because they didn't know what else to do. The host, who had been so ready to end her act politely, stood to the side with his mouth slightly open. He clapped too, but his eyes were full of awe. The woman's modest appearance had not changed. Her plain dress, her quiet face, her simple shoes were still the same. But to the audience she was no longer the same person. With every note she had played, she had transformed. They no longer saw her as someone ordinary. They saw her as someone extraordinary. Her music had carried something deep, something more than just skill. It carried emotion. It carried years of silence and struggle. It carried the beauty of someone who had learned life's pain but still held on to hope. The audience could feel it in their hearts. That was why some of them had tears in their eyes without even knowing why. That was why they couldn't look away. A mother in the front row held her child close, whispering, "Listen, this is what talent sounds like." An old man shook his head slowly, whispering to the person next to him, "All these years, and we never knew she could do this." People began to exchange looks, half ashamed that they had never asked more about the quiet woman, half proud that she belonged to their little town. The woman herself felt something shift inside. For years she had told herself that her music was nothing, that the world would not care. She had hidden it away. She had convinced herself she was too ordinary to be noticed. But as the crowd roared and clapped, she realized that wasn't true. Her music mattered, not just to her but to others. It had touched them, and she could see it written across their faces, the young men in the back, the ones who had started. The joke looked down at the floor. Their laughter had vanished completely. They shuffled in their seats, embarrassed. One of them whispered, "We shouldn't have," but his voice was drowned out by the cheering. They had wanted to make her small, but instead she had grown larger than any of them. The host finally stepped forward, raising his hands to calm the crowd. His voice shook a little when he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen." His words sent another wave of clapping across the hall. The modest woman gave a small bow of her head, her cheeks flushing red. She wanted to shrink again, to slip back into the shadows. But the crowd would not let her. People began shouting, "Play another! Play another!" Their voices rose together until it felt like the roof of the hall would lift. The woman shook her head at first, her hands tightening on her lap. She wasn't sure she could do it again. She wasn't sure her heart could take it. But the crowd begged, their voices filled with excitement, their eyes filled with hope. She looked down at the piano once more, her old friend, the instrument that had been her secret for so long. She thought about all the years she had walked past it at home, too afraid to let anyone hear her play. She thought about the loneliness of playing only for herself. And now here was a crowd that wanted to listen, not to laugh, not to tease, but to truly listen. Her fingers trembled as she placed them back on the keys. She glanced once at the crowd and saw faces glowing with respect and wonder. Some were smiling, some were wiping tears, some were leaning forward as if they couldn't wait. For the first time, she didn't see judgment in their eyes, only admiration. That gave her strength. She began to play again, this time with more confidence. Her hands moved gracefully, her back straight. The music flowed smoother, richer, as though the piano itself was celebrating with her. This time, the crowd didn't wait until the end to react. They sighed softly, they nodded their heads, they let the music take them away. The hall was no longer just a hall. It had become a place of beauty, of connection. The modest woman played not for applause, not to prove anyone wrong, but because at last she was free. Free to share what she had always carried inside. Free to stop hiding. Each note was her truth. Each chord was her story. She poured herself into the song until her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. When she finished again, the applause was even louder. People were shouting her name now. People who had ignored her for years were looking at her with shining eyes. The same crowd that once mocked her now treated her like a star, and through it all, she sat there quietly, her hands folded on her lap, her head lowered, still the modest woman she had always been. But in the hearts of everyone who had heard her, she was no longer just modest. She was unforgettable. The applause still echoed in the hall long after her fingers had left the keys. People were buzzing with excitement, whispering to one another, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. They had come expecting an ordinary night of fun, laughter, and lighthearted acts, but they had stumbled upon something much deeper. The modest woman, who had walked on stage looking so shy and unsure, had turned the evening into something unforgettable. As the noise settled a little, whispers spread quickly. People began to recall things they had heard before, little pieces of gossip or half-forgotten stories. Someone in the front row leaned toward her neighbor and said, "I think I heard she studied music when she was younger." The neighbor's eyes widened. Really? I thought she just worked in the shop. Another voice from the back added, Didn't she once live in the city? I remember hearing something about lessons abroad, but then she came back suddenly. The rumors rolled through the audience like a wave. Everyone was piecing together a puzzle they had never cared about before. The woman who had always been, seen as quiet and ordinary, now appeared as someone mysterious, someone with a hidden past. They realized that she hadn't just played well by chance. She had played like someone who had trained, who had lived and breathed music. The young men who had pushed her onto the stage sat uncomfortably. The more people whispered about her past, the worse they felt. They had wanted to expose her as a fool, but instead they had revealed a treasure. One of them muttered, We should never have made her do it. His friend nodded silently, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Meanwhile, the host finally found his voice. He stepped forward with a broad smile, his voice carrying through the microphone. Friends, I think tonight we've learned something. We've learned never to judge someone by how quiet they are. Sometimes the most extraordinary talents hide where we least expect them. His words were met with cheers, but the crowd barely needed reminding. They had already felt the lesson in their hearts. The modest woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the whispers. She heard bits and pieces of what they said, but she didn't respond. Memories stirred in her chest, memories she hadn't thought about for years. She remembered being young, sitting at another piano far away. She remembered her teacher's voice telling her she had a gift. She remembered dreaming of concerts, of grand halls, of audiences just like this one. But life had taken a different turn. She had left her studies. She had returned home because of family needs. She had set aside her dream to care for others, to live a modest life where no one asked about her music. Over time, the silence had grown, and she had convinced herself that her music no longer mattered, that it was just a part of her past. But tonight those notes had brought it all back, and the people had seen what she once was. A woman in the second row leaned forward and called out, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" The modest woman smiled faintly, her eyes soft. She didn't answer right away, but her silence was enough. People understood. She hadn't told them because she hadn't needed to. She had chosen to live quietly, and no one had ever thought to ask. But now the truth was out, and the hall was alive with admiration. The young girls in the audience looked at her with wide eyes, inspired by the idea that someone so simple could hold such greatness. The older men nodded in respect, realizing they had underestimated her all these years. Even the children, who usually grew restless during music, were sitting still, replaying. The sound of her song in their minds, the whispers grew stronger. She could have been famous, one person said. She still could be. Another added quickly, if she plays like that, the world needs to hear her. A few began talking, about inviting her to bigger events, about writing her name in the local paper. Some were already imagining how far her music could go. The woman felt their admiration like a wave, but she also felt the weight of their expectations. She had never wanted fame, never wanted attention. She had been happy to live modestly, but as she looked at their faces, she realized something important. Her music was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who listened. It touched them in ways she could never have explained with words. Maybe she had been wrong to hide it for so long. The hall grew quieter as people waited, hoping she would speak. Finally, in a soft voice that carried more weight than they expected, she said, "I once dreamed of music, but life had other plans. Tonight, you gave me back that dream." Her words sent a shiver through the room. People clapped again, not as loudly as before, but with deeper feeling. They weren't just clapping for her skill anymore, they were clapping for her story, for her courage, for the hidden truth she had finally shared. The host, sensing the emotion, stepped forward again. "Then perhaps this is only the beginning," he said warmly. The crowd cheered in agreement, and once again voices rose, begging her to play more. The modest woman turned back to the piano, her hands resting gently on the keys. She closed her eyes, and in that moment she was no longer thinking of fear or shame. She was thinking only of the music, of the gift she had once hidden but could no longer deny. And as the next notes began to flow, the people leaned in once more, their hearts open, ready to receive the truth she poured out with every sound. They now knew they weren't just listening to a modest woman. They were listening to a story, a life, a soul that had been quiet too long. ChatGPT said. The last note of her second song faded into the air like a feather drifting slowly to the ground. For a long moment no one moved, no one breathed, as though the entire hall was afraid that even the smallest sound would break the magic that had just been created. Then suddenly, as if a spell had been lifted, the entire crowd leapt to their feet. The applause was so loud it shook the old wooden beams of the hall. People shouted, clapped, and even whistled. Their faces were bright with awe and excitement. The modest woman sat still, her hands resting on her lap. She was overwhelmed. She had never felt so many eyes look at her with respect. For years she had been invisible, walking quietly through life. But now everyone was standing for her. People who had once ignored her presence were now on their feet, cheering as if she were the most important person in the room. The host walked back onto the stage, his voice barely able to rise above the thunder of applause. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words trembling with emotion, "tonight we have been given a gift none of us expected, but one we will never forget." He turned toward her and bowed slightly, showing her the same respect the audience felt. The crowd cheered even louder. Some people were crying openly. An old woman dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, whispering to her friend. It was like hearing angels. A man in the back clapped so hard his palms turned red, shaking his head in disbelief. Children jumped up and down, shouting, "Again! Again!" The entire hall had been transformed by her music. It was no longer just a fun evening, it had become a memory, a story that people knew they would tell for the rest of their lives. The modest woman lowered her head, her cheeks burning with a soft blush. She tried to slip away quietly, to stand and return to her seat, but the crowd would not let her. They shouted for more. They begged her to play again. Some even moved closer to the stage, clapping in rhythm. Their voices echoed together. "One more song, one more." She looked out at them, her heart full. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, but she could see now that her music was no longer just hers. It belonged to the people, too. She had touched them, and they wanted more. She gave a small nod, placed her hands back on the piano, and began to play a softer, gentler piece. The crowd grew quiet instantly, leaning in to catch every sound. This time the music was not bold and powerful. It was tender, fragile, like a whisper of truth. Each note fell like a raindrop, soaking into the hearts of those listening. By the time she finished, tears shone in many eyes again. The applause that followed was not wild this time. It was steady, deep, and full of love. The young men who had teased her earlier stood up too. Their faces were red with shame. They clapped the hardest, trying to hide the guilt in their hearts. They had been the ones to push her into this moment. And though they had meant it as a joke, they now realized they had forced her to share a gift that changed everyone. They looked at one another, and for once none of them had the courage to laugh. The host raised his voice once more. "This woman has shown us something powerful tonight," he said. "Talent is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, waiting, hidden, until the right moment. And when it comes, it humbles us all." His words drew another wave of cheers, and people stomped their feet on the floor in agreement. The hall shook with the sound. The modest woman stood slowly, gave a shy bow, and tried to step away from the piano. But the crowd surged forward. Some wanted to shake her hand. Some wanted to thank her. Some wanted simply to be close to her. Children reached up, asking her name again and again, as if learning it for the first time. "Who is she?" People whispered. "How could we have never known?" Even as the cheers rang in her ears, the woman remained humble. She smiled gently, whispered thank yous, and lowered her gaze. She had not played to win their admiration. She had played because she could no longer keep her music inside. But now that it was out, she knew nothing would ever be the same. For the people of the town, that night became a story to tell. They would speak of the modest woman who had been called to the stage as a joke but stunned everyone silent with her first note. They would tell how the laughter had died, how the music had taken its place, and how they had all been changed by it. As she finally left the stage, the applause followed her, echoing in her ears. She walked back to her seat, but everyone's eyes stayed on her. She was no longer invisible, no longer just another face in the crowd. To them, she was now someone extraordinary, someone unforgettable. And though she still carried herself with the same quiet humility, deep inside she felt a new warmth, a strength she had not known in years. The world had seen her gift, and in return, she had been reminded of who she truly was. When the evening finally ended, the crowd did not leave right away. People stayed in their seats, still talking about what they had witnessed. The hall was buzzing with excitement and wonder. The modest woman had already returned to her chair, her face lowered, hoping the attention would fade, but it didn't. Every few seconds someone turned their head to look at her, whispering to their neighbor, shaking their heads as if they could not believe she had been among them all this time. The host tried to close the event with his usual cheerful voice, but even he sounded different, softer, as if he too was still caught in the spell of her music. "Friends," he said, "tonight was not just another talent show. Tonight we discovered something precious. We saw greatness hidden in plain sight, and we will never forget it." His words drew another round of clapping, though quieter now, full of respect instead of wild excitement. When the people finally began to leave the hall, they didn't go straight home. Many stopped near the modest woman to thank her personally. Some shook her hand. Others simply whispered, "Thank you," with tears still in their eyes. A child tugged at her sleeve and said, "When I grow up, I want to play like you." The woman smiled gently, placing her hand on the child's head. Her heart swelled at the thought that her music might inspire others. The young men who had pushed her onto the stage approached too, but their steps were slow and heavy. They looked at each other nervously, ashamed. Finally, one of them spoke, his voice quiet. "We are sorry. We thought it would be funny, but we were wrong." The woman looked at them calmly. She did not scold them. She did not frown. She simply gave a small smile and said, "Sometimes life pushes us where we are meant to be." Her words made their shame even deeper, but also lifted a weight from their hearts. They knew they would never forget this night either. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. People in town told their relatives, their friends. In nearby villages, soon everyone knew about the modest woman who had stunned the hall with her music. A small article appeared in the local newspaper, calling her the hidden jewel of the town. Photographs of her at the piano appeared in shop windows, and people who had once passed her by without noticing now greeted her warmly in the street. At first, the attention made her uncomfortable. She had lived in silence for so long that the sudden spotlight felt strange. But slowly she realized that this was not fame in a shallow sense. It was love. It was respect. It was her community, showing her that they valued her gift, and in return she gave them more of her music. She began to play at gatherings, at small events, always with the same humility, never seeking reward, never asking for applause. Her story inspired many. Parents encouraged their children to follow their passions, reminding them of the woman who had once stayed quiet but carried greatness inside her. People began to look at one another differently, with softer eyes, wondering what hidden talents their neighbors might hold. The hall where she had played became a special place. People would walk past it and remember the night when laughter turned to silence and silence turned into wonder. For the woman herself, something inside had changed forever. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt that her music was useless. She had seen the way her songs touched people, the way it brought tears, smiles, and hope. That was enough for her. She didn't dream of grand stages or worldwide fame. She was content to play for those around her, to give them pieces of her heart through every note. One evening, some weeks later, she sat alone at home with her piano. The room was quiet, the window open to the soft night air. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. Not for an audience this time, not for applause, but for herself. Yet even as she played, she thought of that night in the hall. She thought of the faces that had changed, the people who had listened with their hearts. And she smiled. She had been pushed onto the stage as a joke, but it had not been a joke at all. It had been fate. It had been the moment when her hidden gift finally met the world, and from that moment on she knew she would never hide it again. The modest woman, once overlooked, once underestimated, had become a symbol of quiet greatness. And though she remained as humble as ever in the hearts of the people she had played for, she would forever be remembered as the woman whose first note had stunned everyone into silence.